How do you expose S-Cinetone? I'm going to give you a couple tips. I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube about S-Cinetone. People are always saying it's a straight out of camera profile. It's a what you see is what you get profile. But the footage they show, the example footage they show, oftentimes will feature really blown out highlights on skin tones or on like light colored fabrics of people's clothes. Definitely some things that people are not taking into consideration or they're not being super careful about when they tell you how to expose S-Cinetone. And to be fair to all those creators, S-Cinetone is supposed to be a straight out of camera, what you see is what you get profile with minimal corrections, minimal grading needed or required depending on your own preferences. Obviously, this is supposed to be something that is going to give you a pleasing look. You can sort of think of it as being akin to all the film profiles that you get in a Fujifilm camera, you know, Eterna, Provia, Reala, Bologna, etc. It's supposed to replicate the look of the Sony Venice. So you don't necessarily have to go out of your way to make this footage look spectacular in post-production. The thing with S-Cinetone that you have to understand is it has kind of an interesting curve. Not only does the exposure change as you either expose it evenly or over or underexpose it, but the qualities of the contrast and the saturation in the image change depending on how brightly or how dimly you expose it. Things that are overexposed in the image, say 75 IRE and above, probably in that range, things are less saturated and less contrasty. Parts of the image that are sort of middle exposed and underexposed get deeper saturation and more contrasty. And since this is S-Cinetone, cinematone, in my opinion, it looks best when it is middle and underexposed because I think that cinema tends to be middle and underexposed as opposed to television, which is probably more brightly exposed. That's my baseline recommendation for S-Cinetone if you want to make it as simple as possible. Underexpose it. This video is going to be pretty informal, pretty relaxed, and of course there's going to be chapter markers, so if you want to skip around, check those out. Everything I shot in this video was shot on either the FX30, which is the camera I'm using to film this section, or the a6700, and they have identical sensors and processing, so the images should be identical between these two cameras. So those are what I'm using to test S-Cinetone, but these tips should be applicable to any Sony camera that has the S-Cinetone profile, but the base ISOs will be different depending on the camera that you have. Let's get into Resolve and just take a look at some of the test images that I shot. I tried a bunch of different things to figure out how do you expose S-Cinetone. So I tried 40 IRE and I tried 45 IRE as middle gray using this gray card that I'm holding in the shot there, but the reverse side. So I just set my zebras to 40 IRE in camera and got zebras on this gray patch here. And that was my 40 IRE exposure, and I did the same thing for 45 IRE. And in my opinion, both of these shots are overexposed. You can see on my skin that it is too bright. Just really no detail here on my arm at all, really either arm, and that's at 45. And then even at 40, we're getting a little bit of that back, but it's still, in my opinion, too hot, too bright on my skin. So that didn't work. I went into the color page and tried to see how much of that information I could recover. And you can see how you're getting more contrast and more saturation as you darken the exposure. These kind of specular highlights are okay. The highlights in S-Cinetone tend to be a little brittle looking. They have sharp edges and they seem a little blotchy. They don't have this sort of smooth roll off that you get with S-Log3. And you can see that over here in my left hand, how much of that is just sort of that kind of blotchy overexposed highlight. It's not all recoverable, unfortunately, even at 40 IRE. And then here is 45 IRE, tried to recover, and that's even worse. I did some indoor tests with skin tones, and I think I figured out a little bit better. I have complete control over the lighting. Didn't have to worry about the sun coming in and out of clouds and maybe messing up my exposure. If you want to use the zebras to figure out a good exposure, here is what you can expect. I set the zebras right here on my forehead. So when I saw the zebras, I would back it off until I saw either no zebras or maybe just like one or two little tiny zebras. That's what 45 IRE looks like. That to me is acceptable. Maybe it's a little bit dark for your taste. And then here is 50 IRE. It's probably the optimal exposure in my opinion. 55 IRE, here is 60. 65. I think the range that you should be shooting for is between 50 and 65 IRE, depending on your taste, how brightly you like things to be exposed, also the mood of whatever it is you're creating. If you want it to be a little bit darker, then go down to 50. If you want it to be a little brighter, then expose skin tones at 65. You can see that difference in contrast and saturation even between 50 and 65 IRE. So not only does it get a little bit brighter, but the color of my shirt gets a little bit less saturated, and the skin tones become a lot less saturated as well. 50, and there's 65. Popping back into the skin, I think we're still okay here at 70. This is a complete control over the light, and this is why I would stay away from 70. If you're outdoors and you're moving in and out of sunlight, then this, I think, is where you're going to start getting those really blotchy looking specular highlights that you can't recover in S-Cinetone. Here's what 80 looks like. What happens if you try to bring this exposure down a little bit and maybe match it closer to where that 50, 55 IRE is? So that's what I did here in this node. I just brought the exposure down. The skin is looking better, but it doesn't have the same sort of smoothness and pleasing tonality that I think you get if you just shoot it at 50 IRE. So this is 75 brought down, and there's 50, 75, and 50. Skin tones are kind of close, but another way that you can really see the difference is in the color of my shirt. So this is at 50, and then this is at 80 brought down. I think I was saying 75 earlier, but this is 80 IRE. The color is way off on the shirt. Same lighting, probably the same. I don't even think I stopped rolling the take on the camera. I just adjusted the exposure as I was rolling one continuous take. So nothing changed except for the amount of light hitting the scene. The color of the shirt is way different, and it's much less pleasing in my opinion. It's got a kind of a greenish, yellowish cast to it, almost like a pea soup color. To sum up, you've got complete control over the lighting, and you want to use zebras. 50 to 65 would be the range that I would shoot for. Incidentally, I'm not using zebras to expose this shot. I was eyeballing it. The multimeter on the camera is reading a 0.0 exposure. So now let's talk about if you just want to use the multimeter, how should you expose? With S-Cinetone at ISO 125 at a 0 EV exposure, this looks fine. This would work perfectly well. At -1, I also think this works if you like it a little bit darker. -2, it's too dark, but could work depending on what you're going for. And now going the opposite way, you don't want to overexpose it. It's just +1 EV, and you're already blowing the highlights. Not only are these little lights here on this Rodecaster getting blown out, but even just the white of these books back here are blown out. And then at +2, it's even worse. And you can't bring these back. So here's +1 trying to correct for that. And you're starting to get some of the detail back in the books, but there is still these blown out highlights that you can't recover. And then the lights on this Rodecaster are totally blown out. And then at +2, it looks even worse. You do not want to overexpose S-Cinetone. You get no benefit from it. You're already shooting at a much lower ISO. The base in S-Cinetone in the FX30 and the a6700 is 125 and 400. You're not going to have a lot of sensor noise in either of those ISOs that you're going to try to overexpose and then bring back down like you might want to in S-Log3, which has a much higher base ISO. If you're outdoors, you got no control over the lighting, my recommendation is to shoot for about a -1 EV on the multimeter. This is S-Cinetone at 0 EV outside. You can still see here that we're losing some information. We got these specular highlights on my hand. Here on this post, we're starting to lose some of the information. There's a real hot spot going down this post. So that's just an even exposure on a cloudy day in the shade, and we're still losing a lot of information at 0 EV. But if you just bring it down to -1, you're still getting a really nice exposure, and you have much less risk or no risk of losing any of the information on specular highlights of your skin. That hot spot is gone. And then this also, you've got all the detail back in that. And another example, S-Cinetone -1, nice contrast, nice saturation. And then S-Cinetone at 0 EV, still looks okay, but you can see the difference in contrast and saturation just between 0 and -1. It'll just depend on if you have a particular hot patch of sun coming through. It already looks better at -1. So just avoid a 0 EV exposure outdoors. Another way you can try to expose for S-Cinetone is using highlights. Clipping point is around 100 on the FX30 and the a6700. And I would actually aim a little bit lower than that just to give yourself some latitude. I set my zebras to 99 for this shot, and I think this turned out pretty good. Skin tones are still exposed really well. We're not really losing anything. And obviously it's a super cloudy day, so we don't expect the sun to come in and blast us. Again, I would recommend shooting for maybe a 90 IRE threshold for your highlights just to be safe, especially if you have a sunny day or if it's a cloudy day with more chance of the sun coming through, then you'll have a little bit better chance of retaining highlights if anything changes. Maybe that was a little bit all over the place. So let me just recap. If you are outdoors with no control over the lighting and you want to use the multimeter, I would aim for a -1 EV reading. If you use 0 and the light changes, if it gets brighter, then you have a significant risk of clipping your highlights on skin or a bright colored shirt or something like that in the scene. If you're indoors, you've got complete control over the lighting, then you can aim for a 0 EV exposure, but I still think that -1 might look okay. So it just depends on your preference and how you want to light the scene. If you want to expose for skin tones using zebras, to recap, I think you should be aiming for between 50 and 65 IRE on the brightest section of the skin. Set it where they are actually receiving the most light in the scene. So if you have them stand in the shade and set it for 65 and then they walk out into the sunlight, then it's going to totally blow out. I hope that helps. Let me know. Thanks for watching.